Lesson 1.2, the Kincaid Mound Builders. In this lesson, we're going to talk about the Kincaid Mounds, which is an important Native American archaeological site found here in the southeastern corner of Massac County. It actually lies right on the Massac County-Polk County line, with some of the mounds being inside of Massac County and some of the lines being on private property in Polk County. Now, this is not going to be a lesson on all Native American cultures here in Illinois. It's mainly going to focus on the Mississippian culture and the Kincaid Mound Builders, which were actually a civilization of Native Americans that predates most of the common Native Americans we hear about in early American history. Now, early Native Americans migrated to North and South America during the last ice age about 30,000 years ago. And that's just kind of a rough estimate because we're not 100% for sure exactly when. However, DNA evidence is actually starting to really kind of blow the doors off of this new history because we're able to actually track the different generations of Native Americans quite a far ways back in history. Now, these early Native Americans were hunter gatherers originally that would have followed a lot of migratory herds of animals, primarily across a land bridge that connected Asia and Alaska here in North America. They would have followed herds all throughout North and South America, spreading out as they did so. Now, eventually, they would develop agriculture, which is farming, and their main crops would be maize or corn, beans, and squash. However, there were several other kinds of varieties of crops that they would have also grown, but these three would have been their staples. Now, maize, as we know it today, or corn, was actually a little bit different than it is today. It was quite a bit smaller and came in a lot more different varieties of color. Nowadays, traditional corn that we grow is primarily yellow and large, and actually genetically modified to produce more sugars, either be sweeter to taste or produce different types of sugars that we can turn into either cattle feed or animal feed, or even often ethanol, which is a fuel that we use for cars. Now, these Native Americans would actually develop very complex trade networks across the Americas. And over time, these Native Americans developed very strong bonds with one another. Now, they did develop into different cultural groups, and they were not ignorant of one another. They were very much aware of the different cultural groups found throughout North America. Now, the Mississippian culture, which was actually the Native American culture that the Kincaid Mound Builders were a part of, mainly settled along the Mississippi River and along its tributaries like the Ohio, the Cumberland, and the Tennessee rivers. Now, the Mississippi culture built large earthen mounds in their villages and cities for a variety of different reasons, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. They established far reaching trade throughout North America, and by all accounts, this was a North American, Native American empire at one point. The closest sites include Kincaid and Wycliffe Mounds to us, Wycliffe being just south of Cairo, Illinois, and then Kincaid obviously being here in Massac County. Now, the largest mounds are actually found near St. Louis at Cahokia. It's a town that you would actually approach around the area that you would get to like Fairview Heights area if you're ever going to St. Louis. Cahokia is kind of a turnoff from the interstate, and you can actually visit these mounds, and there's a really nice visiting center there. Now, Cahokia, just to kind of talk about this largest settlement, was the largest Mississippian city within 20,000, with 20,000 people living there. A lot of our knowledge about the Mississippian people come from Cahokia. They constructed wooden walls, they had guard towers, wood hinges, which was used probably for ceremonial purposes, but practically it was essentially a calendar that utilized the sun and the stars and the moon. And this was probably mainly to monitor when they should plant and harvest crops. Now, Monk's Mound was actually the largest Mississippian mound built by at Cahokia. By volume, it's actually larger than the pyramids of Giza. It's not as tall, but the volume of the mound is actually quite large. Now, the Kincaid Mounds found here in Massac County actually have 19 mounds at the site, 10 of which are actually on private property and you cannot visit. They're located in the bottoms of Massac County and Polk County, and it was once the site of a large settlement for hundreds, if not thousands, of Mississippian natives. It linked the Mississippian villages with the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers with Cahokia. So it was kind of like a hub, a trade hub. Now, the Kincaid Mounds have 19 mounds at the site, 10 of which are on private property on the Pope County side. These mounds are located in the bottoms of Massac County and Polk County. And what that means is it is in an area where the elevation is quite a bit lower. And so as a result, it is prone to flooding. It is also one of the more rich farmland areas here in Massac County. And so the name Kincaid actually comes from the farming family that once owned this land. So the Native American cultures are probably never, well, they definitely never called themselves the Kincaid Native Americans. The name Kincaid comes from the original farming family of European settlers that once lived there. Now, the Kincaid mounds, I think sometimes we underestimate exactly how massive and large this settlement was. It would have been complete with walls. It would have had several houses around these mounds, probably hundreds, if not in some points, probably thousands of Native Americans would have once lived here. It would have been pretty detrimental on the natural resources of the area, specifically trees. And so it probably would have strained the area with this many people living there. They built large mounds for their ceremonial centers and for their important individuals. But it would have been a massive city down here. It would also have been a very important location for the rest of the Mississippian culture found throughout North America. Now, it did link the Mississippian villages in the Tennessee and Cumberland River valleys with Cahokia. So there were actually several mound sites throughout North America along the Mississippi, Ohio, Tennessee, Cumberland rivers, and several of the tributaries like the Wabash. And so, with all these mound sites throughout America, there needed to be a trade network. And Cahokia was the mound system that was actually closest to where the Tennessee and Cumberland rivers met with the Ohio, and it was very close to the Mississippi River. So, it was kind of a natural place for a large amount of trade to take place at. Now, the purpose of the mounds is actually pretty interesting, and there's several different purposes for the mounds, and it really does depend on the mound. Some of the mounds were burial mounds that should be noted, and typically those mounds were not lived on top of, and as individuals died, the mounds grew over time. Now, Mississippian people constructed temples and homes and other important buildings on top of those mounds. Probably to protect those buildings, protect the individuals inside, but then also kind of to brag about status. Now, the mounds allowed Native Americans to monitor the settlement. Obviously, you could see pretty far on top of these mounds, so it also gave them a natural advantage of being able to see their settlement, what their people are doing, but then also to monitor and potentially protect their crops in nearby fields from people who might want to steal or other kind of damage that can be done to them. Now, in the event that you were under attack, mounds actually provided a decent amount of defense. As you can imagine, if someone attacked a city and they were able to breach the wooden walls, the palisade walls, Native Americans that lived in these centers could very quickly retreat to these mounds, making it very difficult for anyone who is attacking to really get to those people. Typically, if you have the high ground, you're always going to be at the advantage. Now, actually, one of the things that I think is just most interesting about the Kincaid mounds, as you can see in this video here, is actually here's the Kincaid mounds right there. You just zoomed in on. Those are the top of the Kincaid mounds. This video was taken back in the 2011 flood that hit Massac County in the area. And as you can see, the top of these mounds are relatively dry. So it can be reasonably assumed that these mounds probably provided some kind of protection against flooding. And considering that your most important individuals and buildings were on top of these mounds, it was probably pretty beneficial for their culture and their society. Now, mounds also served as a status symbol. Simply, if you were able to live on top of a mound, that meant you were probably more important to that culture or society, or at least it meant that you had more power. It took a lot of work and effort to build these mounds, and so it should be no surprise that those people who lived on those mounds had a little bit more sway within those societies. Now, as the Kincaid Mound system continued to flourish, the reality is that the Mississippian culture did not last forever. It would eventually be replaced by Native American cultures that we're more familiar with, like the Cherokee, the Shawnee, the Illini, the Choctaw, and several other different tribes that lived in the Mississippi and Ohio River valleys. Now, the decline of the Mississippian culture probably began around 1300 and kind of culminated in the year 1400, which is actually about 100 years before Christopher Columbus ever discovered America, meaning that the Mississippian culture declined separately from any kind of European interaction. Um, there's a lot of different reasons why. The reality is, we don't really know for sure why the Mississippian culture declined, why Cahokia was vacated, and why Kincaid was eventually abandoned by Native Americans. And it's not really 100% for sure if it was ever truly abandoned. It may have just been that the culture itself kind of dissipated and just very small numbers of people lived there. Some scientists and archaeologists have theorized that it was overpopulation. The Mississippian culture was actually just really, really good at surviving and building an empire, and they just had too many people. They didn't have enough resources, and there was conflict within those populations, and it just kind of disintegrated, which is something that happens to several different empires throughout history. Some have theorized that it was a cooler climate. There does appear to be some archaeological data to suggest that there was a cold snap that could have disrupted crops, leading to famine, and then eventually people dispersing from these large settlements. Also, disease. We're not exactly for sure what kind of disease, but disease has been suggested. However, one should note, though, that there's no large numbers of dead bodies that would have been found or dug up at this time period. So the disease argument is probably actually pretty slim. There may not be an actual strong argument for that. One thing that is really seen as a possibility is the depletion of local lumber and resources. Native Americans in these communities basically devastated the landscape for lumber, and this can be very easily seen in the Cahokia Mound area, where they had several thousand Native Americans living at one point. Between fuel and building and other things like that, lumber was kind of a premium, and there is definite signs of lumber depletion and forest depletion around these sites. So there may have been a simple lack of lumber for fuel and building that eventually led to the decline of this culture. And then there's all kinds of different theories on conflict. It could have been outside invasion, it could have been civil war, it could have been conflict within the population itself that could have led to the decline. Or it could have been a combination of several of these reasons. It probably is more than one of these reasons why the civilization would have declined. But what we do know is that by about the year 1400, Cahokia and Kincaid were pretty much abandoned. And then, 100 years later, when Christopher Columbus discovers the Americas, which he has no contact with any Native Americans in this area, um, basically are ancient history to the other Native Americans that Columbus and the European explorers come into contact with. It's more or less ancient history. When Christopher Columbus does come in 1492, it's going to be pretty devastating for Native Americans. It's going to begin this thing called the Columbian Exchange, where goods from the Americas are traded with Europe, and goods from Europe come to the Americas. For example, Europeans never had a tomato before Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492, which meant Italian pizza and spaghetti had no pasta sauce made out of tomatoes. Actually, spaghetti is not even an Italian dish, but that's something we'll talk about later. And then at the same time, horses and pigs came from Europe and Asia to the Americas. Potatoes were in South America and came to Europe, and so on and so forth. Now, one of the things that came from Europe into the New World was actually diseases like smallpox and typhus and diphtheria, cholera, plague, the measles, influenza, or the flu, measles, mumps, and whooping cough. And it spread very rapidly within Native American culture, mainly because Native Americans had a tradition of gathering around the sick whenever they become infected with something, which would only perpetuate the spread of disease. Without even any real help from Europeans, 90% of all Native Americans are going to die from diseases as a result of the discovery of the Americas. And that's going to devastate the Americas, the Native American population.